The view from the airplane heading to Hawaii was breathtaking, but I never imagined that my ex-girlfriend from middle school, whom I hadn't seen in years, would be sitting next to me. What's more, she brought up our past and went on a rant about how worthless I was. Then, she started bragging about how happy she is now, married to a wealthy guy, and how much her husband needs her, even though I wasn't asking. Just then, an announcement came over the intercom.
Is there anyone on board who can fly a plane?
It seemed like there was a serious problem. It was surprising they were looking for a pilot and not a doctor. The other passengers began to realize the gravity of the situation and started murmuring, "Fly the plane. Is everything okay with this flight?" As the flight attendant began walking through the aisle, she saw me and exclaimed.
Oh, you are.
What followed was an event that finally shut my ex up. My name is Jack Smith. Ever since I was a kid, I had an extraordinary fascination with airplanes. I was always interested in things that could fly. The sight of birds and insects gliding freely through the sky was always beautiful and cool to me. I dreamed of flying myself one day and thought that if I tried hard enough, maybe I would grow wings. But to my dismay, no matter how hard I tried, I never grew wings. I was 5 years old when I first saw an airplane. A lifeless hunk of metal was soaring through the sky. It was a family trip with my parents. That giant metal bird soaring through the sky symbolized freedom to me and left a lasting impression. From then on, I became a boy who loved airplanes more than cars or trains. I memorized the names of planes and airlines and spent my days looking at planes in encyclopedias. My parents, noticing my passion, took me to the airport once a week. They thought seeing real planes in motion would be good for me. My parents and younger brothers didn't share my admiration for planes, but they always listened with smiles as I excitedly talked about them. Naturally, my dream was to become a pilot. I wanted to fly through the sky and control a plane. It was my first real dream. Even as a child, I knew it was a practical dream. My dad used to say, "To be a pilot, you need to study hard." I was quite a good student, and studying was a small price to pay for my dream. My teachers often said, the secret to excelling in studies is to have a clear future goal. They were right. Knowing that studying was essential to becoming a pilot made me eager to learn. Moreover, when my dad joked that you can't be a pilot with cavities, I became the most diligent toothbrusher. Maybe good enough to be a dental hygienist. By the way, the cavity thing isn't true for all pilots. It's just for some fighter pilots because of air pressure issues. And when I heard that you need to be physically fit to be a pilot, I worked hard on fitness too. My childhood was more about planes than playing. In middle school, I started seriously thinking about the path to becoming a pilot. I knew I needed to go to a good high school and college to fly planes, so I kept up with my studies and sports. During the sensitive period of adolescence, I was also mindful of my friendships. I tried to get along with everyone and not make unnecessary enemies. I tried to avoid stressful people but still interacted with many, hoping to learn and grow from them. I don't mean to brag, but I was quite popular. I honestly didn't feel bad about it, as I was getting a lot of attention from the girls. My male friends often asked how I managed to be so popular, but I wasn't studying or exercising to impress anyone, so I couldn't give them a satisfying answer. During this time, one of the most beautiful girl in our grade asked me out. She is Susan Johnson. She was one of the top beauties in her grade and popular with students and teachers alike. I was thrilled and said yes without much thought. I had carelessly said okay with a light heart. It was my first relationship, and little did I know how troublesome it would turn out to be. Susan was overly controlling in our relationship. She got upset if I talked to anyone she didn't know, regardless of their gender, and expected me to buy her things to improve her mood. She even insisted I delete any female contacts from my phone and demanded immediate responses to her messages. She was incredibly self-centered and inconsiderate. To top it off, she'd say things like, "I want you to be my ideal boyfriend," and would encroach upon my study and exercise time.
Spend every weekend just for me. Oh, and of course, you're paying for our dates. Making your girlfriend pay is just the worst.
Which was a lot to ask from a middle schooler. Gradually, I started feeling suffocated in the relationship. That summer, my dad passed away in an accident. It hit me hard, as he was always looking forward to and expecting great things from my future. My mom became visibly worn out and lifeless, and although I wanted to cheer her up, I was too overwhelmed with my own grief to be of much help. Our family was engulfed in deep sadness. Losing my respected father meant that all of us had to struggle to keep living. My mom, who had been a stay-at-home mom, started working outside. This meant I had to take over caring for my younger brother. Naturally, this cut into my study and exercise time, but I didn't mind. It wasn't hard for me to do it for my family. Of course, it wasn't just my personal time that was cut down. I also reduced the time I spent with Susan.
Why don't you contact me?
When she asked, and I explained my family's situation.
So what? Isn't it fine if your mom works? And why do you need to take care of your brother? She can do it when she gets back from work.
Her response was shocking. I couldn't believe her lack of empathy towards a family grieving the loss of a father. I broke up with her, saying, "I don't need a girlfriend who can't be considerate during tough family times." I didn't want to be further destabilized by her. Later, at school, rumors spread that Susan had dumped me. She also spread false stories about me. Seeing her true nature was eye-opening, but I was too occupied with my own issues to care much. I even considered skipping college to work and ease my family's burden. My mom opposed the idea, but eventually, reluctantly, she gave her permission. The only things I felt confident in were physical activities and studying, so I planned to find a job where I could utilize these skills. On graduation day, Susan mockingly asked,
Aren't you going to college?
I just replied yeah, without making eye contact, and tried to distance myself from her. She snidely commented from behind, "In this day and age, not going to college defines your limits. Enjoy living at the bottom." I knew I'd never see her again, and there was no point in getting upset over her words, so I just ignored her and left the school. Now, time has passed, and I'm currently going through the boarding process for a domestic flight. It's a personal trip to Hawaii, which I'm super excited about since I've never been there. I've always imagined Hawaii as a place with beautiful beaches and rich, flavorful food. Unfortunately, being quite far from home, I never found the time to go. I was also hesitant about traveling alone, not knowing where to visit and worrying I'd end up just staying in my hotel. However, a friend recently opened a restaurant there, so I'm going to celebrate with them. In addition, I decided to have a friend show me around Hawaii, so I plan to take my time and do some sightseeing. And can't help feeling giddy like a kid. I settled into my seat comfortably. I actually enjoy the slightly hectic atmosphere inside the plane before takeoff. After stowing my carry-on under the seat, I gazed out the window. Even though we weren't flying yet, the view from this window was unique and already exciting. I was quite pleased with myself for securing such a great seat, away from the wings for an unobstructed view. It was the best. There was still some time before takeoff, so I let my imagination run wild with thoughts of the amazing views above the clouds. The plane was nearly full, but the seat next to me remained empty. I wondered if no one had booked it or if they were just running late. It felt a bit awkward, being the only one with some extra space in such a crowded setting. As I looked outside, trying to pass this awkward time, there was a loud thud. A passenger who seemed to have made it just in time settled into the seat next to me, rummaging through their things and accidentally bumping me with their elbow. Without a word of apology, she was also giving off a strong scent of perfume and cosmetics. I hadn't encountered someone as unreasonable as this since middle school. The person sitting next to me in the airplane reminded me unpleasantly of those times, reflected faintly in the window glass. I noticed she was wearing something black over her eyes, probably sunglasses. That's all I knew. Wearing sunglasses inside a plane seemed pretentious to me. But maybe that's just my prejudice. After fidgeting for a bit, this tasteless fellow passenger glanced at my face. I inadvertently looked back and immediately regretted it. Despite the heavy makeup and flashy appearance, I recognized her. An unwelcome blast from the past.
Oh, if it isn't a high school dropout, how are you doing?
My heart sank as I realized my much-anticipated trip was taking off into stormy weather. Quite the metaphor, if I do say so myself. When I remained silent,
Have you forgotten me? You haven't forgotten that I was the one who dumped you, right?
she then took off her sunglasses. It was Susan, my ex-girlfriend from middle school. Her beauty was unchanged, but her character clearly hadn't improved, judging by her opening remarks.
It's been a while since graduation, right? So surprising to see you here. A dropout like you flying on a plane? That's pretty bold. Or are you heading to work on a tuna fishing boat or something?
She hadn't changed a bit, still the same old Susan. It's good to see she's still as spirited as ever. Susan started chattering away. Her specialty was belittling others with such rapidity it seemed she might forget to breathe. Truly a terrifying woman. I must say, though just to myself, I've never heard of anyone going to Hawaii to work on a tuna fishing boat. Maybe she should broaden her knowledge a bit. I simply responded, "It's a vacation," and then turned my attention away from her, focusing on the magnificent view outside the window. The plane began its slow movement towards takeoff. What should have been an exciting flight turned into a dive straight into hell because of just one seat. Sleeping quietly over the wing would have been infinitely better. My cold attitude seemed to have offended Susan. She started going off on me, saying things like how I was the worst boyfriend ever, how her college boyfriends were way more handsome, and how dating me was a waste of time, all designed to provoke a response from me. Apparently, after college, Susan married some rich guy and hit the jackpot. I wasn't paying much attention, so all I remembered was her marrying rich. Now, she was off to Hawaii for a swanky vacation, staying in a luxury hotel and enjoying the resort life. A place she claimed I could never afford to stay in my entire life. Her husband, it seems, is totally smitten with her, living a life revolving around Susan. Well, some people are like that. I hope Susan will cherish him for the rest of her life, as I think such people are rare. I am sure that if she misses that person, she will never get married again. While listening to Susan's self-centered ramblings, I couldn't help but admire the beauty outside the airplane window. As soon as we took off, the view below turned into a blanket of white clouds. No matter how bad the weather is, once you rise above the clouds, a bright blue sky always shines through. The beautiful sky always reigns above the clouds, with glimpses of the ground peeking through the gaps. But when will the cloud next to me clear up?
You, being a bottom dweller, probably don't get to fly much, so this view must be rare for you.
She continued to mock me. Susan even bragged about having flown so often that she was bored of the scenery and couldn't even bother to look out the window anymore. I wonder why she goes to such lengths to lower her own value. High self-esteem is good, but this attitude of hers was beyond my understanding. I can't believe I ever dated someone like her. If I ever have kids, I'll make sure to instill this lesson in them. Life stains shouldn't be set in stone by middle school. It's a pity, really. And about getting bored with the view from an airplane because you've flown a few times. I don't buy that. The scenery changes with the day and time, so you never see the same view twice. What a waste of an opportunity, I think. Just as she was passionately expounding on how great she is,
Is there a doctor on board?
an announcement came over the PAR system. It's a line I've heard in dramas, but never in real life. Perhaps someone had collapsed and needed medical attention. I was concerned but knew there was nothing I could do. I decided to wait quietly, unlike my ignorant neighbor, Susan, who exclaimed,
What's this? This is just like a drama. I can't believe this is happening.
Her excitement was misplaced, to say the least, especially considering someone was probably in bad shape. Clearly, a few screws were loose in her head. As I paid attention to the cabin, another announcement followed.
Is there a pilot on board who can fly the aircraft?
Even I was taken aback by this. The passengers had been a little unsettled by the first announcement, but now the cabin erupted into chaos. Is something wrong with this plane? Does the pilot need a doctor? These and other questions filled the air. It made sense. First a doctor, now a pilot. Something must have happened to the cockpit crew. Susan's face went pale, and she started to panic.
What? Is this plane going to crash?
She blurted out. The last thing we needed was someone spreading panic with talk of a crash. This is why I dislike people who can see beyond themselves. A flight attendant hurried over to Susan, especially after she loudly mentioned a crash.
Please, ma'am, nothing like that is going to happen. Stay seated.
The attendant urged. Susan argued with the flight attendant, who expertly guided her back to her seat. Then, the attendant noticed me.
Mr. Smith, by any chance?
We locked eyes and I asked, "Is it that serious?"
Thank goodness you're here. I'm terribly sorry, but could you help us out?
It seemed the situation was indeed grave. Despite my initial skepticism, Susan's reaction might not have been entirely unfounded. I nodded and stood up.
Where do you think you're going? If you're just going to get in the way, you might as well stay here and tremble pathetically.
Pathetic is more like you, I thought, but I swallowed the words. The attendant asked if she was with me. I firmly denied it. Just an old acquaintance. We happened to be seated next to each other, a mere stranger on the roadside. She has nothing to do with me. I was eager to head to the cockpit, but Susan grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go.
Where are you going in this situation?
I pleaded for her to let go, but she didn't budge. Then the attendant stepped in.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Smith is one of our pilots, and he's needed urgently.
The attendant's firm and polite tone finally made Susan release my arm.
You're a pilot?
Susan's eyes widened in surprise. I simply replied, yes, and headed towards the cockpit. The area around the cockpit was crowded with attendants, all in a state of commotion. I learned that both the captain and the co-pilot were showing symptoms of gastroenteritis. Fortunately, there happened to be a doctor on board who was attending to them. Unfortunately, the condition of the pilots didn't improve and only got worse. This made it difficult for them to fly the plane as planned, leading to the urgent announcement for a pilot. Acute gastroenteritis can occur suddenly without warning, so it was probably unavoidable. Nevertheless, both pilots getting gastroenteritis at the same time seemed like a freak occurrence, almost a miracle or, more fittingly, a disaster with incredibly low odds. Surrounding the cockpit were many familiar faces, and upon seeing me, they exclaimed,
"Wow, what luck that Jack Smith is on this flight too."
Both pilots were down with gastroenteritis, a doctor coincidentally on board, and now a pilot among the passengers too. It felt like I had used up all my life's luck in one go. The doctor mentioned that the co-pilot's symptoms were less severe and he was just able to converse, though he was sweating profusely. After some persuasion, we got in touch with the control room, and I took my place in the pilot's seat. The tension and excitement of being in the cockpit never seemed to fade. The fact that I was carrying passengers added immense pressure. When I first started flying, the thought of being responsible for the lives of my passengers used to make me so nervous I felt like throwing up. But at the same time, The view reserved only for pilots unfolded before my eyes, a magnificent sight not perceivable from the passenger seats. The hot sunlight illuminates everything around, even transforming the thick clouds below into a beautiful backdrop. This ultimate feeling of elation, something only a pilot can experience, filled my heart as I operated the aircraft. I felt like my brain was flooded with strange hormones. Such was the immense joy of sitting here. At least for me. I remember once sharing this with a flight attendant who called me a weirdo. I feel sorry for Susan. She claims to be bored of such views without ever having seen them. Thankfully, the plane landed safely in Hawaii, and all passengers and crew were safe. The captain and co-pilot were immediately taken to the hospital. The doctor who had been taking care of them quipped,
"You being here was a lifesaver. If it were just me, everyone would have been on their way to the hospital, not just those two."
Stroking his chin beard, he said, "What an inappropriate joke." But I guess that was his way of appreciating me. Still, a safe landing doesn't change the fact that this was a major incident for the airline. So, even after arriving in Hawaii, I was busy with paperwork and reports, finally getting free only after the sun had set. As planned, I hurried to my friend's newly opened restaurant. Of course, I drive safely. The place was already bustling with customers. My friend and the owner, Michael, greeted me with a big smile and a slap on the back. "Good to see you made it."
I heard you had quite the day, piloting a passenger plane and all.
Where did he get that news? I hadn't planned on bragging, but since he already knew, I felt obliged to talk about it. While rubbing the sore spot on my back from Michael's enthusiastic greeting, I sat down and recounted the whole ordeal. "That's some incredible odds right there," Michael laughed. "It's been 5 years since you left the force. Time flies." Indeed, thinking about how it had already been 5 years made me somewhat dismayed by the swift passage of time.
"Is this gentleman a friend of the master?"
I heard a gentle voice behind me. Turning around, I saw a distinguished-looking gentleman smiling at me, with Susan, no less, standing beside him. Michael, always sincere, returned the smile. It seemed this gentleman was a regular at the restaurant.
This guy was my colleague in the Air Forces. He was outstanding. Served in the United States Air Force Air Demonstration Squadron at Nellis Air Force Base.
Michael explained in detail. I thought such specifics might be lost on an ordinary person.
"Thunderbirds, you mean?"
But the gentleman's eyes lit up. He revealed that he had once dreamed of becoming a pilot, but due to an accident in his childhood that severely affected his right eye's vision, he had to give up on that dream. He was just like me, a true airplane enthusiast who remembered not only the names of airplanes and airlines, but also the units of the Air Forces. It had been a while since I'd met someone who loved planes as much as I did, so I got a bit too excited talking to him. I was there to celebrate Michael's new restaurant, but I ended up getting deeply engrossed in conversation with the gentleman, neglecting Michael a bit. This gentleman was particularly fond of the Thunderbirds and started speaking passionately about their exhibition flights. Our intense discussion was interrupted by none other than Susan.
Honey,
She called out to us with a refined tone. The gentleman said,
"Oh, I'm sorry. I get carried away."
apologized, scratching his head. I thought there was no need for him to apologize to someone like her, but since they seemed to be a couple, I kept my mouth shut. When he learned Susan and I went to middle school together, his eyes sparkled with interest again. He bombarded me with questions. Upon asking where I was currently working, I told him I was a civilian pilot. He looked puzzled, which made sense, since Michael and I knew each other from our Air Force days, and anyone passionate about planes would naturally think of flying fighter jets. I had been in a traffic accident years ago, which rendered me unable to fly fighter jets. I still love the sky, so I transitioned to civilian aviation. I explained, it was a rainy day 5 years ago when a car ran a red light at a crosswalk and hit me. The driver was distracted. We settled for damages, so I don't hold a grudge anymore, but the accident broke my left leg and required extensive rehabilitation. Because of that, I couldn't meet the flight hour requirements and was dismissed from my pilot duties. The after effects of the accident meant I couldn't handle the physical strain of flying a fighter jet. I was indeed devastated at the time. It was a dream I had since childhood, and my late father had supported it so much. But his teachings helped me through. The past is the past. There's no use dwelling on it. Do the best with what you have now. If I had wallowed in self-pity, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish even what was still possible. When I could no longer fly fighter jets, I was offered a desk job, but flying was non-negotiable for me. So, I resigned from the Air Forces and switched to civilian flying. Becoming a civilian pilot was more challenging than I anticipated, with various hurdles. But I never gave up. My place was in the sky, nowhere else. After finishing my story, Susan's husband, Chris, seemed moved, his eyes brimming with tears.
I've never met someone as incredible as you. Your unyielding spirit is truly inspiring. If it's okay with you, can we keep in touch?
He pulled out his phone. I couldn't refuse after such praise, and honestly, I was flattered. We continued our conversation about airplanes. During this time, Susan seemed to shrink and kept looking down. Susan's husband introduced himself as Chris. Chris owned several properties in Hawaii and other American resort areas, a well-known real estate magnate. Susan's story about marrying into wealth wasn't a lie. As I had half doubted, Chris frequently stayed in touch after we met in Hawaii. He was a straight arrow type, a stickler for integrity, highly respected in various circles. That such a man chose Susan as his partner was surprising. It made me wonder if she had somehow tricked him. Then, one day, I got a message from Susan.
Never tell my husband about us dating in the past. Don't ruin my happiness.
I wanted as little to do with Susan as possible, but thinking about Chris, I wondered if I should let him know. It's a dilemma. Susan must be somewhat aware of her past insincerity. Her character probably hasn't changed much since the plane incident, but she must have worked hard to marry a wealthy man. If she went to such lengths, I won't be the one to ruin it for her. Though it's quite ironic. Honestly, I think even if I don't tell Chris about Susan's true nature, it'll eventually come out. But until then, let her savor this brief period of happiness. I simply replied to Susan, understood. After that, there was no further response from her. Susan will likely live her life hiding her past from her husband. In fact, it seems that's the only way she can live now. She must be living in fear, constantly worried about her past and her mistreatment of others being exposed. That's the responsibility and consequence of her past actions. The past never disappears. Sometime after my trip to Hawaii, I happened to run into Chris at the airport. He looked much thinner and seemed worn out. When I approached him, he revealed that he and Susan had divorced. It all started a while after the incident in Hawaii when a friend of Susan's visited their home. Chris was at home for work and didn't want to disturb them, so he stayed in the next room using his computer. The friend was apparently from Susan's middle school, and they were speaking loudly enough that Chris couldn't help but overhear their conversation. They were laughing crudely, calling someone from their school days by a nasty nickname and mocking them. My name was also mentioned. Hearing Susan and her friends laughing about how it's best to marry a rich man made Chris explode with anger. He stormed out of his study into the guest room, shouting at them to get out now. He kicked out Susan and her friend and didn't let them back in that day. Later, it was discovered that Susan had been misusing their savings and spending lavishly. When confronted, she lashed out at Chris, accusing him of being stingy despite his wealth. Chris had initially hoped for a change of heart and a fresh start, but Susan's unapologetic attitude about her extravagant spending and her complaints about not owning enough luxury items were the last straw for him. I wasn't surprised by her behavior, knowing her as I do. The more Susan insulted Chris, the more distant his heart grew from her. Eventually, he had enough and initiated divorce proceedings. Susan's attitude changed dramatically when faced with divorce, pleading that she didn't want to split and that it was all just a misunderstanding. She probably never imagined it would come to this. It seems her mind was always centered on herself. When Chris threatened to take legal action, she reluctantly signed the divorce papers. The process involved disputes over property division and took a while to settle, but Chris recently finished it all. Chris said, "I thought she was a wonderful woman, but her true character was beyond my wildest imagination." I completely agreed with him. People are not always what they appear to be. Sure, good looks might matter when you're young, but as an adult, being with someone whose substance matches yours is vital, otherwise it becomes a burden. After the divorce, Susan moved back to her hometown to live with her parents. Having been a housewife, she struggled to find employment and had to live modestly to repay her debts. It's true what they say, what goes around, comes around. Susan's behavior, not just toward Chris, but throughout her life, mocking others has now come full circle. After hearing all this from Chris at the airport, we parted ways. Stepping outside, I looked up at the overcast sky. It was cloudy, but I knew what lay beyond. Above the gloomy clouds, a clear blue sky stretches endlessly. That view from the cockpit is a pilot's privilege. If Susan could come to appreciate such sights, maybe then she'd finally understand what it means to be human. Being a pilot comes with its trials, but it's worth it for the views. As I continue to ensure the safety of my passengers, I'm motivated by the beautiful vistas I get to witness. Today reaffirmed my commitment to my vocation,